and good morning. I'm very pleased to be here today. I will give you just a very quick background on Inclusion International so you have a sense of the perspective that I'm speaking about. Inclusion International is the international organization that represents people with intellectual disabilities and their families globally. We have members in about 115 countries. Here in Israel, Akim is our member organization, and we're very proud to be here and to be working with Akim on a number of issues, and particularly on the issues of living independently and being included in the community. A couple of years ago, during the almost a decade ago now, working in promoting the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, Inclusion International worked with its member organizations to determine what the priorities they felt should be included in the convention were. Just figuring out my logistics here. We took the issues, I'm going to skip through because I don't want to use up too much time on background. We spoke to our member organizations about what they believed the key issues were in the negotiation of the convention. And the 4 issues that our members told us were important to them to bring forward in the negotiations were recognition of the role of families, inclusive education, legal capacity, which is the right to make decisions, and living in the community. None of these things are exclusive of all of the other aspects of the convention, but for our members, these were the issues that they said were foremost important to them. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the ways we've been promoting, since the negotiation of the convention, we've been promoting the how-to in a lot of these issues. So the convention itself, as you know, was formed by people with intellectual disabilities. There was a large delegation during the negotiations of people with intellectual disabilities. There was also a delegation from Inclusion International representing families. And you will have heard some of the stories about how we impacted together the development and the formation of different aspects of the convention. After the convention was adopted, one of the questions to Inclusion International was, well, what shall we do in promoting the convention and the issues that we managed to secure in the convention? We decided that what was really important as a very first step was to have the perspectives of people with intellectual disabilities and their families understood in relation to some of the key articles. And so we began a process of having global campaigns which focused on the priority issues that our members had identified. So we had a global campaign on inclusive education in Article 24. We've had a global campaign on the right to live and be included in the community, Article 19. And we've had a global campaign on Article 12, the right to make decisions for ourselves. And I just to show you the documents, and you can find them on our website, we did global reports on each of those issues. So in 2012, we released the report on inclusive communities are stronger communities. And in 2014, we released a report called Independent But Not Alone, which refers to Article 12. And the title of this report reflects, I think, one of your very first comments is that while Article 12 is about living and having control on your life, it doesn't mean that you have to do that alone. So I just want to talk to you about some of the findings of our global campaign on Article 19, the right to live and be included in the community. And I use the full title of the article because I think that what's important, and what was important during the negotiations, was that we weren't just talking about where people lived. We were talking about the notion of inclusion. And I think that it's particularly important for that message to be heard as Israel is going through a process of deinstitutionalization. And I heard yesterday, very excited to hear yesterday about the commitments of the Israeli government to move people out of large residential institutions. The physical act of moving people out of institutions, however, is only one step in the process. What we've learned, and what we learned from our global campaign, is that the process of including people in the community is much, much bigger process than the physicality of where someone lives. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we heard from our members in the global campaign. we set out to talk to members. We have, as I mentioned, we have members in about 115 countries. Many of those organizations were founded by parents. Many of them have evolved to be a voice of people with intellectual disabilities and their families jointly. Some of them are very small organizations in places like Africa. In other places, they're very large and well-established organizations that have a powerful voice with governments and provide supports to people in their communities. And so we surveyed our members. There were focus groups, there were regional forums, there were a number of ways in which we engaged our membership to talk to them about what does it mean to live and be included in the community, what have you learned from this process, and what are some of the challenges for our members in different parts of the world. And the purpose of the campaign really was to ensure that our voices were heard in the interpretation of what Article 19 should mean. It also was to raise awareness about the exclusion and isolation that people with intellectual disabilities continue to face. And it was to identify the necessary conditions for achieving inclusion in the community. What does it take? How do we do it? And then I think a unique point was, what's the process of change? How do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And so, as you probably know, Article 19 provides a framework for looking at what living and being included in the community means. It was negotiated by and including people with intellectual disabilities and their families, and it's a tool for working with our governments. Primarily, Article 19 is about choice. It says persons with disabilities have the opportunity to choose their place of residence and where and with whom they live on an equal basis. And choice means having the opportunity and options to make decisions, understanding decision-making, empowerment, having a voice, being able to express what we want, supports to make those decisions, and sometimes choice is about innovation. It's about creating new options, new thinking. Article 19 is also about support. It specifically says that people with disabilities have access to a range of in-home, residential, and other community supports, including personal assistance necessary, etc. And that support means that people should have the right to services, that might be attending care, employment support, disability-specific services. It might mean income support and disability benefits. It might mean personal support by families, friends, and community. To the families, those supports mean planning and information services, compensation for income loss and disability costs, and respite. The third aspect of Article 19 is about inclusion, and this is where I think people often will forget what it is we're talking about in building supports. Community services and facilities for the general population are available on an equal basis. And this piece, I think, is really important and gets left out very often. It means that our generic global systems have to be inclusive. So education, employment, access to justice, healthcare, transportation, all of those things that the general population are able to access need to be available and accessible to people with intellectual disabilities if our process of including people in the community is going to work. These are just some pictures of some of the families and people who we engaged in the report. And I'll skip quickly to the findings because I want to get to my very last slide, which is some lessons about deinstitutionalization. The report itself was not only about deinstitutionalization. What we heard from families and self-advocates were some very important messages for policymakers and for our family organizations. They told us that people with intellectual disabilities have no voice or control in the decisions about where and with whom they live. We probably knew that, but it was a profoundly strong message that people are not given options and they're not given a say in where they live. We also read that the vast majority of adults with intellectual disabilities live at home with their families. And this was not unique to the Global South, it was not a regional, this was consistent in what we heard from our member organizations around the world. We also heard, though, that institutions continue to be a major human rights violation, and there's evidence in some regions that the admission of children is increasing, and that new forms of institutionalization are forming. We learned that the major source of support and care which adults with intellectual disabilities receive is from their families, and that families themselves receive little or no support from communities or governments in providing that support to their family members. And even when people with intellectual disabilities live in the community, they're often isolated and excluded from the community. Largely, we found that was because services continue to be delivered in a segregated and institutionalized system, and because communities fail to organize to be inclusive. And those of you who attended Steve Eidelman's presentation yesterday will have heard him refer to the term, and I always give you credit for the term, Steve, in any presentations that I do, a second-order deinstitutionalization. What we've done is move people into the community. What we haven't done is made sure that they're included in those communities. And so I think the implications of what we heard from people themselves about the living and being included in the community is several important points for policymakers and for family-based organizations who play a role in supporting people in the community. The first is that choice requires legislative and policy reform. We have to go after the issues that keep people from having an ability to have a say in their lives. We have to develop supported decision-making models. We have to find ways to support people in having their voices heard. And we have to fund both what we refer to as the supply and demand side. So very often, what we do and what governments do is they provide one kind of service, one kind of housing, one kind of option. And for people with disabilities, that means you have one choice, which is not real choice. The other issue, I think, in terms of support is that we need to be thinking about family-friendly public policy. A lot of the disability supports that get provided in most countries are focused on individuals, which is of course important. But what we don't take into account is the role that families play and how we support families to be able to play a role in supporting their family members in the community. We also need to develop supports to the individual and supports to the family generally. And then finally, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, I think it's really important that both governments and civil society organizations begin to think about those larger systems and how they may or may not be including people with intellectual disabilities, either in education, employment, health, and other sectors. And so this is my last slide, and I wanted to end on this because I think that there is an important discussion going on in Israel at the moment, and what we can learn from what we heard globally of the experience of closing institutions. There's quite a lot of information, and you are all, I'm sure, thinking and talking about these things in different circles. But from my point of view, as I listen to the experiences of our members in many countries around the world, there were several key things that I think get forgotten in the process of deinstitutionalization. The first is that the tendency is to say, let's close the institution, yes. Let's take out the people who are easiest to serve first, and then we'll deal with those who are harder and more difficult to support in the community. The result of that is that the doors never close. We always have a reason to keep the doors open, and there's always a reason to put more people back in those buildings. We need to shut them down, and we need to take the people who are hardest to serve first to prove that we can do it, and then we can make sure that those buildings never open again. The second thing that I think is really important is that the process of closing institutions and moving people into the community is not a physical act. The transition itself requires support. It requires financing, and it requires that you have multiple stakeholders involved in the process. And so for a period of time, the institutions will remain open while you are moving people into the community and finding ways to build their community. That means that there are going to be transition costs, and those costs cannot be ignored. This is not a dollar here to dollar here exercise. And I think that governments need to understand that that transition period will have resource and human costs, and that they need to invest in that process. And then finally, I think we have to be very clear that deinstitutionalization is not about moving services from a building to the community. Deinstitutionalization is about building community. It's about building supports in a person's life. It's about figuring out how that person might develop relationships in the community. And it means that the way we support people goes from being caregivers to being supporters and facilitators in the community. And that fundamental difference means changing the way that we support, changing what our organizations do in the community, basically changing the mandate of what we thought we were doing for the last 50 years. So I want to end on that note, and I want to wish you lots of luck. And Inclusion International is here and would love to be supportive in any way we can to the journey you're about to embark on, and I applaud you for taking this first step, and I look forward to hearing about your progress. Thank you so much.